Total tax paid for Sir Keir Starmer for the tax period 2021 to 22 was just over £67,000. It shows that he made a capital gains contribution of £85,466 in that financial year, on which he paid £23,930 in capital gains tax. It said that the sum reflected his share of the capital gains when his sister decided to sell a house that he had helped her buy. This was on top of his £126,154 a year income for being an MP and leader of the opposition. So in the period 2021 to 22, that tax year, income tax, Sir Keir Starmer paid just over £43,000. He paid just over £23,000 in capital gains, and that brings a total of tax paid of just over £67,000. That's in comparison to the Prime Minister, who paid a total tax last year of £432,000 in that same period. Let's bring in our correspondent, Amanda Acas. I'll breathe a sigh of relief. Not great on tax and figures, but Amanda's been taking a look through. So that total tax paid in that year, just over £67,000, which may or may not have been expected. But what's the reason for Sir Keir releasing this? Remind us.
Yes, so Sir Keir promised in January that he would release his tax returns along with the Deputy Labour leader and the Labour Chancellor if they win the next general election. But now Rishi Sunak has released his tax returns, well, a summary of them. Sir Keir Starmer's obviously decided that in the interest of transparency, he needs to release his equivalent information. Now, it's not actually, as we saw with the Prime Minister, it's not actually a formal tax return. Rather, it's a kind of summary of the income and tax paid altogether. And I think it is really quite striking, the comparison with the kind of amounts that we saw from the Prime Minister, who clearly is a very independently wealthy man. So, as you say there, Sir Keir Starmer paid £67,000 in tax. His total income was, in terms of his savings and the income he made from his salary as an MP and leader of the opposition, was a total of £126,621. Now, in terms of that comparison with the Prime Minister, well, his income from earnings and savings came in at just under double that, so £329,000. But the real difference is about the differentiation in the amount of capital gains made by the Prime Minister. So last year, that was a figure of 1.6 million that he made in capital gains, whereas Sir Keir Starmer's equivalent figure was 85,000, which we do have an explanation on this from his accountant, saying that this is because he'd bought a house with his sister for her and her children to live in. So this reflects the share of the capital gains made when his sister decided to sell that property. So clearly it's still a lot of money, but in comparison with the total figure for the Prime Minister, it's obviously very different. So just to summarise again, the total tax paid by Sir Keir Starmer last year, £67,000, in comparison with more than £400,000 for the same period paid by Rishi Sunak, reflecting the very different amounts of capital gains made by the Prime Minister. Now, the Prime Minister's investments were largely tied up in a trust, which is set up in America, because, of course, that's where much of his financial career was based before he went into politics. It's held in a blind trust, which is something that politicians tend to set up when they take office, which means that they don't actually control where those investments are made. The idea is to avoid a conflict of interest. But critics also argue that it's not good for transparency, because also it means that they don't have an obligation to disclose where those investments are made. And they do know what they are when they're first initially made, although they don't have control over subsequent decisions. So there are always questions asked about those, although no suggestions that anything improper has been done. But I think think it's interesting that we're seeing these returns being released. I mean, in America, there is an expectation that political leaders, the presidents, not Donald Trump, of course, but previous presidents have released their tax returns. It's not something that British prime ministers or political leaders have typically done. The last prime minister to do it was David Cameron. Boris Johnson and Liz Truss didn't do so. Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell did, though. So for Labour, perhaps there is more of a more recent track record. But obviously, the question of senior political leaders' finances have really come into scrutiny over the past year. We had the scandal over the penalty paid by Nadine Zahawi when he was Chancellor. And then we also had the questions raised over the non-dom status of Rishi Sunak's wife, who, of course, is a very wealthy woman. She's the daughter of an Indian billionaire. She was born in India, so that's why she had that non-dom status on her worldwide income. But obviously, questions were asked. There was an uproar because she was the wife of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, obviously in charge of the UK tax system at the time. So in response to that, she said she would voluntarily start paying tax on her worldwide income. Clearly, Mr. Sunak's tax return, which was released yesterday, didn't include his wife's taxable income. But obviously, that's why there's such a scrutiny, because the Sunaks are believed to be the most wealthy couple ever to have inhabited Downing Street. So clearly now Mr. Sunak says he's done this in the interest of transparency. So Keir Starmer wants to follow suit. But I think the key issue that many saw with Mr. Sunak's tax returns was really this huge amount of capital gains that he had made, and the fact that the tax rate for capital gains is so much lower than the tax rate for income. So he paid a tax rate of around 20% on that. Indeed, that's what Sir Keir Starmer would have paid on his capital gains as well. But many really questioning why, in a time when there's such a cost of living crisis, it is that the wealthy, who tend to be the ones who make more of their income from investments and capital gains, can benefit from that lower tax rate compared to the tax on incomes, which more people rely on, of course.